My friends, for a moment, let us become still together, not to acquire anything, not to reach towards something beyond our grasp, but simply to rest in the awareness that where we stand, God already is. We have been conditioned for centuries to believe that God is somewhere above us, beyond us, outside of us, a great power to be summoned, persuaded, or convinced. And so, in our moments of need, when fear shadows our hearts or confusion clouds our vision, we fall into the habit of pleading with a God we imagine to be far off, listening from a distance, withholding his answer until we have prayed long enough or fervently enough. But I would like you to consider with me a truth that has been hidden by our very sincerity. Your prayers are not unanswered. They are misunderstood. For every time you have reached outward, heaven was already within you. Every cry you believed ascended toward God was already enveloped in his presence before the words were spoken. There is nothing out there to reach, nothing above to climb toward, nothing beyond to convince. The spiritual life is never a journey toward God. It is the recognition of God as the very life of your own being. This is the great mistake of human seeking. The belief in a God who must be found, a God who must be approached, a God who must be moved. And so long as you pray from that sense of separation, you bind yourself to the very distance you fear. But in truth, there is no such distance. There is no separation between you and the one who is your life, your breath, your awareness, your capacity to feel, to know, to be. When we turn to God as though he were apart from us, we deny the very truth we seek to experience. And the moment we deny it, the moment we place God elsewhere, we feel abandoned, lost, unheard. Today, let us begin by admitting something simple. God has never failed to answer you. He could not fail, for his presence is the answer. It is we who have failed to recognize the way in which God makes himself known, not through the granting of things, not through the rearranging of circumstances, but through the revelation of himself as the only life, the only mind, the only source. And so, in our moments of need, when fear shadows our hearts or confusion clouds our vision, we fall into the habit of pleading with a God we imagine to be far off, listening from a distance, withholding his answer until we have prayed long enough or fervently enough. When we turn to God as though he were apart from us, we deny the very truth we seek to experience. And the moment we deny it, the moment we place God elsewhere, we feel abandoned, lost, unheard. And now, having laid aside the old habit of reaching outward for God, let us look more deeply into what we mean when we speak of the presence. For unless you understand the nature of God, you cannot understand the nature of prayer. And unless you understand the nature of prayer, you cannot understand why your seeking has left you weary, why your petitions have left you barren, why your cries have so often seemed to echo into silence. So I invite you not to strain and reach for God, but to relax into the quiet recognition that the fullness of God is already where you are. The purpose of this hour is not to teach you how to make God respond. The purpose is to awaken in you the realization that God has been responding from the beginning, because God has never been absent from your own being. Today, let us begin by admitting something simple. God has never failed to answer you. He could not fail, for his presence is the answer. It is we who have failed to recognize the way in which God makes himself known, not through the granting of things, not through the rearranging of circumstances, but through the revelation of himself as the only life, the only mind, the only source. Therefore, when we speak of the presence, we are not speaking of something to be brought into your experience. We are speaking of that which is already the substance and reality of your being. The presence is not to be found, it is to be recognized. And this recognition occurs not through effort, not through repetition, but through the simple surrender of the belief that God is elsewhere. God is not a being somewhere waiting to be addressed. God is not a distant intelligence orchestrating events from a heavenly throne. God is not a power that comes and goes according to our moral standing or emotional fervor. No, God is the infinite, invisible, the living presence that is the very essence of your own consciousness. God is the life by which you are alive, the awareness by which you are aware, the intelligence by which you think, the love by which you love. God is the ever-present reality awaiting the lifting of your inner shade, the relinquishing of the belief that you stand apart. Or reflect on the wave of the sea. The wave does not plead with the ocean to move. It does not ask the ocean for energy, for direction, for motion. It is the ocean in expression, and so are you. You are not separate from the source of your being. You are not a creature standing before its creator. You are the very expression of the one life, appearing as individual consciousness, individual form, individual experience. There is no line dividing you from God except the line drawn by human belief. When Jesus declared, "I and the Father are one," he was revealing the truth of your own identity. And when you recognize this truth, not intellectually, not philosophically, but inwardly, you will discover that there is nothing for God to give you because God has already given you himself. And in that gift, all things are included. Consider the light in a room. The moment the shade is lifted, the moment the obstruction is removed, the room is filled. The light has not traveled. The light has not increased. The light has not responded to a request. It has merely revealed itself where the barrier no longer stands. So it is with God. God does not come to you. God does not answer by movement or by distance. Let this realization settle gently within you. God is not absent. God is not distant. God is not waiting. God is the very presence of your own being, the light within your awareness, the life within your life. The moment you cease to search outwardly, you begin to feel the nearness of this presence, and the nearness reveals itself as the answer to every need, every prayer that rises from fear, from desperation, from a sense of lack or abandonment, is a prayer that declares, "I am separate. I am alone. God is far off." And in that declaration, whether spoken aloud or merely felt within, you erect the very barrier that prevents you from realizing the presence that is already here. The moment you beg, the moment you plead, the moment you attempt to persuade God, you affirm that he is not yet where you are. And if you believe he is not yet present, how can you experience the answer that depends upon his nearness? Understand this principle clearly. Prayer is not an act that draws God to you. Prayer is the state of consciousness that recognizes God where you are. When you ask God to give, you deny that God has already given. When you ask God to act, you deny that God is already active as your very being. When you plead for healing, for supply, for direction, for comfort, you unknowingly confess, "I am a separate self, and God must respond to me." But there is no separate self, only the one expressing as you. This is why begging God blocks the answer. Not because God is offended by your pleading, not because God waits for perfect faith or perfect words. No, because the cloth of your consciousness is being woven from threads of separation, and you cannot receive unity while believing in separation. You cannot experience the presence while insisting through your very prayer that it must arrive. And if you believe he is not yet present, how can you experience the answer that depends upon his nearness? Let us bring this understanding nearer so that it becomes not merely a spiritual concept, but a living experience. For truth, when held only as theory, remains barren. But when allowed to touch consciousness, it becomes the very bread of life. I will offer you several quiet illustrations, not to give you formulas, for there are no formulas in the life of the Spirit, but to help you recognize the nature of recognition, how it appears, and why it transforms your experience without effort. The spiritual life is never the attempt to make something happen. It is the quiet yielding to what already is. When you say, God, help me, you imply that help is absent. When you say, God, heal me, you imply that wholeness is distant. When you say, God, provide for me, you imply that supply must be summoned from outside your being. And with each such prayer, you bind yourself to the appearance of the very lack you long to escape. The presence has never been absent. It is only our belief in absence that veils the truth. And now, having seen why the prayer of pleading cannot reveal the presence, let us consider the great transition in spiritual life, the shift from asking to recognizing. This shift is not a technique, not a discipline, not an exercise of the human will. It is a quiet yielding, an inner opening, a softened awareness in which we cease to reach outward and begin to behold what is already here. For centuries we have been taught to pray with words, with requests, with petitions. We have believed that if we ask long enough, fervently enough, God will grant the desired blessing. But spiritual truth does not unfold through accumulation. Spiritual truth unfolds through removal, the removal of the false sense of self, the removal of the belief in separation, the removal of the conviction that God must be persuaded to act. And the moment these veils are lifted, the moment the mind stops striving, something gentle and profound occurs. You do not feel that God has answered you. You feel that God has been answering you from the beginning. You do not sense that God has arrived. You realize you have ceased resisting His nearness. Recognition dawns not as a burst of emotion, but as a simple, quiet certainty. I and the Father are one. This truth is not a doctrine. It is not a statement to be memorized or repeated. It is a revelation that emerges when the mind grows still. You are not recognizing a union to be achieved. You are recognizing a union that has never been broken. Asking implies distance. Recognizing reveals oneness. Let us look at this more practically. When you are fearful and you ask God for protection, you affirm danger. When you recognize the presence, you discover that safety is already the nature of your being. When you are ill and ask God for health, you affirm disease as a power. When you recognize the presence, you behold that the life of God is the only life you can ever express. When you are in lack and ask God for supply, you affirm absence. When you recognize the presence, you discover that the substance of God has never ceased flowing as the activity of your existence. Do you see? Asking keeps the mind fixed on the appearance. Recognizing lifts the consciousness above the appearance. Asking strengthens the belief in the very condition you wish to escape. Recognizing dissolves the belief and leaves only the truth. Consider first the individual who is anxious about the future, uncertain about a decision, restless for direction. The human impulse is to say, God, show me what to do. God, guide me. God, speak to me. But you see, the moment he prays in this way, he has placed guidance outside himself. He has imagined a God who must respond from elsewhere, who must impart wisdom as though it were not already present. And so long as he believes guidance must come, he cannot perceive the guidance that is. You are not trying to make something happen. You are not shaping the future with thoughts or affirmations. You are simply recognizing that God is the only presence, the only power, the only life acting in, through, and as you. And in that recognition, your experience changes not because you have changed God, but because you have changed your sense of God. This is the heart of spiritual practice, not striving, not pleading, not directing divine activity, but recognizing the presence that has never ceased being your own true identity. Let us bring this understanding nearer so that it becomes not merely a spiritual concept, but a living experience. For truth, when held only as theory, remains barren, but when allowed to touch consciousness, it becomes the very bread of life. I will offer you several quiet illustrations, not to give you formulas, for there are no formulas in the life of the Spirit, but to help you recognize the nature of recognition, how it appears, and why it transforms your experience without effort. Consider first the individual who is anxious about the future, uncertain about a decision, restless for direction. The human impulse is to say, God, show me what to do. God, guide me. God, speak to me. But you see, the moment he prays in this way, he has placed guidance outside himself. He has imagined a God who must respond from elsewhere, who must impart wisdom as though it were not already present. And so long as he believes guidance must come, he cannot perceive the guidance that is. Now watch what happens when the same individual becomes still not asking, not begging, and simply acknowledges the intelligence of God is the very mind that is functioning as me. He does not strain to hear an answer. He does not try to force clarity. He rests in the simple recognition that there is only one mind, and that mind is already active where he is. And in that resting, the anxiety dissolves and a quiet knowing begins to arise. The direction he sought unfolds naturally, not because God has spoken newly, but because the obstruction of seeking has dissolved. Consider the one who struggles with illness. Out of deep sincerity, she may plead, God, heal my body, remove this sickness, make me well. But the plea itself affirms a belief in a power apart from God, a power of disease, a power of matter, a power that must be overcome. And as long as she believes disease is a power, she cannot perceive the presence that knows no disease. Now observe what happens when she becomes still and recognizes the life I am living is the life of God. Infinite life knows no illness. She is not affirming against disease. She is not trying to make God heal her. She is simply recognizing that her true being is not material but spiritual, not mortal but divine. And in that recognition, fear dissolves. And as fear dissolves, the body begins to respond not because God has acted, but because the illusion of separation has lost its foundation. Consider now the one pressed by financial strain, burdened by bills, responsibilities, or uncertainty. His instinct may be to pray, God, provide for me, open a door, send supply. And yet, in such asking, he affirms lack, he affirms the absence of supply, he imagines a universe in which God's abundance must be summoned. But when the same individual quietly recognizes God is the substance of all form, and that substance is already the life that is expressing as me, he discovers that supply is not something to be gained, but something to be seen. The form of supply may change an opportunity, an idea, a connection, a shift in circumstances, but the substance behind it is always the same, the infinite nature of God expressing itself. And in that recognition, opportunities begin to appear often quietly, often unexpectedly, not because God has moved, but because consciousness has opened to perceive what was always flowing. Do you notice the pattern? In each case, guidance, health, supply, the answer does not come through striving or persuasion. It reveals itself when the individual ceases to ask and begins to recognize. When the belief in separation dissolves, the inherent harmony of the presence becomes visible. These examples are not techniques. They are simply windows through which you may glimpse the nature of spiritual living. You are never trying to get something from God. You are awakening to the truth that God is already the fullness of your being. And the moment you recognize this, even in a small degree, harmony begins to unfold without struggle. Let us now come to what may be called the heart of the spiritual life, the practice of the presence. Without this practice, truth remains theoretical. With it, truth becomes living experience. But let us be clear from the beginning. The practice of the presence is not a discipline of the mind, not a mental exercise, not a technique to master. It is the simple, gentle art of becoming aware of what already is. It is the quiet remembrance that God is closer than breath, nearer than thought, the very fabric of your own being. The human mind is restless. It seeks results. It searches for signs. It craves reassurance. And because of this restlessness, the mind fills our moments of prayer with words, affirmations, denials, requests, arguments. But the presence is not realized through many words. The presence is realized when the mind falls silent long enough for the truth to reveal itself. The infinite cannot be approached with noise. It can only be experienced in stillness. When I speak of stillness, I do not mean the absence of sound around you. I mean the softening of the inner activity that tries to make God act. The practice of the presence begins the moment you stop directing God and begin resting in God. It begins when you release the desire to shape outcomes, to control appearances, to guide the movement of spirit. It begins when you realize that the one you seek is the one who is already living your life. You may wish to sit quietly for a moment, not to think, not to concentrate, but simply to be. Let the mind slow of its own accord. Let the breath flow naturally. And allow this simple truth to rest in your awareness. Here where I am, God is. You do not repeat it to produce a feeling. You do not say it to achieve an effect. You simply acknowledge what has always been so. And as you rest in this recognition, something subtle begins to occur. Thoughts may arise, but their weight diminishes. Concerns may surface, but they lose their urgency. A quiet spaciousness begins to open. And in that spaciousness, the presence makes itself known not as a sensation, not as a vision, but as a calm assurance that needs no proof. This is the beginning of communion. Not communion with a God up in the heavens, but communion with the Spirit, that is your own life. And the more often you return to this inner stillness, whether for 30 seconds or for several minutes, the more you begin to perceive that the presence is never absent. It is always here, quietly waiting for recognition. In this stillness, you do not ask for anything. You do not outline desires. You do not declare needs. For the moment you ask, you assume the presence lacks awareness. The moment you declare, you assume the presence needs instruction. Instead, you rest in the simplicity of being, without demand, without effort. And in that resting, the veil of separation thins, and the truth begins to reveal itself in ways the human mind cannot orchestrate. You must understand, the presence is not realized through strain. It is not felt through intensity. It is not achieved through spiritual ambition. It reveals itself when the mind stops struggling. In quietness, the infinite becomes perceptible. In silence, the truth shines through. And once you touch this inner stillness, even for a moment, you begin to understand why Jesus went apart to pray, not to persuade God, but to rest in the awareness of his oneness. This is the practice of the presence, not doing, but surrendering, not seeking, but recognizing, not asking, but abiding. And as this becomes your way of living, not just an occasional exercise, but a gentle thread woven through your day, you will begin to feel a shift in your very sense of identity. You will discover that the presence is not something you enter. It is something you awaken to. And in that awakening, the entire nature of your life is transformed. As we continue to dwell in this awareness of the presence, there arises a natural question. If I no longer ask God for things, if I no longer outline blessings or plead for intervention, then how will my needs be met? How will the answers come? And the reply, my friends, is profoundly simple. The answers do not come through effort. They reveal themselves through grace. Grace is not something bestowed upon the worthy. Grace is not a reward for righteous behavior. Grace is the perpetual activity of God expressing itself where there is no resistance. Grace is the spontaneous, effortless fulfillment of divine harmony the moment you cease blocking it with fear, with striving, with the belief in separation. You do not make grace operate. You do not direct it. You do not summon it. Grace is eternally present, eternally flowing, eternally expressing. It is only the restless human sense of self that obscures its evidence. When that restlessness quiets even slightly, the natural harmony of the presence emerges into your experience. Let us look at how this occurs. Often the first sign of grace is not a change in outer conditions, but a softening within. A burden lifts, a fear dissolves. The mind becomes clear, tranquil, unhurried. You may find that something you once felt desperate to fix now appears less threatening, less urgent. This inner peace is not the result of circumstances improving, it is the cause of circumstances improving. For when fear loosens its grip, the way becomes open for harmony to reveal itself. Then, quietly, without fanfare, answers begin to show themselves. You may awaken in the morning with an idea that did not exist the night before. You may feel an unmistakable sense of direction, a knowing that does not arise from analysis or reasoning, but from a deeper center of awareness. An opportunity may appear, a conversation, a message, an invitation, a shift you could not have planned. Something resolves itself without your effort, without your strategizing, without your insistence. This is not coincidence. This is not accident. This is grace in action. And understand, grace does not act from outside. Grace acts from within consciousness. When the inner obstruction of fear, doubt, or self-will dissolves, harmony flows into form just as naturally as light fills a room once the shade is lifted. The form may appear as changed circumstances, but the substance behind that form is always the same, the presence fulfilling itself. Many people believe they have demonstrated something through prayer, but in truth, no one has ever demonstrated anything. It is not you who achieve harmony, it is harmony revealing itself when the sense of you dissolves. It is not you who bring healing, it is the life of God expressing its own perfection when the belief in a separate mortal existence is surrendered. It is not you who attract supply, it is the infinite substance of spirit manifesting in visible form when the fear of lack is released. The Father within doeth the works. This is why spiritual answers come without strain. They come quietly, naturally, and often in ways the human mind could never have orchestrated. They come without your pushing, without your planning, without your emotional intensity. They come because divine harmony is already the true state of your being, and when the illusions are lifted, that harmony becomes visible. What must you do to bring forth this grace? Nothing except remove the sense of separation. When you rest in the awareness, I and the Father are one. Grace becomes the activity of your experience. When you cease asking and begin recognizing, the answer reveals itself. When you no longer claim personal power, personal intelligence, personal responsibility for outcomes, the infinite takes over. And what appears in your life is not the product of human effort, but the unfolding of divine order. This is how answers come without effort. Not through the will of man, but through the nature of God. Now, let us turn to the way this truth must be lived. For truth that is glimpsed only in moments of meditation remains incomplete until it permeates the ordinary hours of your day. It is not enough to know in some brief interval of stillness that God is the life of your being. The spiritual life unfolds when this awareness becomes the ground upon which you walk, the atmosphere in which you think and act, the silent rhythm that accompanies each experience. Living from oneness does not mean abandoning your responsibilities, nor withdrawing from the world. It means carrying within you an inner posture of recognition regardless of what the day brings. You go to your work, but you go knowing the intelligence that acts through me is God. You engage in relationships, but you do so with a quiet conviction. The love that flows through me is not personal. It is the love of God expressing itself. You face needs, decisions, uncertainties, but you do so remembering. The substance of every form is the presence that accompanies me. Let us see how this unfolds. This is why spiritual answers come without strain. They come quietly, naturally, and often in ways the human mind could never have orchestrated. They come without your pushing, without your planning, without your emotional intensity. They come because divine harmony is already the true state of your being, and when the illusions are lifted, that harmony becomes visible. You respond not from fear or urgency, but from a deeper center of clarity. Or you may find yourself anxious about finances, about the future, about circumstances that appear uncertain. Instead of rushing to mental planning, instead of projecting fears, you rest in the quiet remembrance. The infinite substance of God is the source of my life. This is not positive thinking. This is not an attempt to manipulate conditions. It is the recognition that removes the belief in lack, and as that belief dissolves, the outer forms of supply naturally take shape. Perhaps you encounter a moment of emotional pain, a misunderstanding, a disappointment, a sense of loneliness. The human self immediately seeks relief, comfort, explanation. But living from oneness means turning gently inward and realizing the presence of God is my sufficiency in this moment. In that recognition, you find that the emotional turbulence begins to settle, not because the world has changed, but because your inner ground has shifted from the personal to the spiritual. Living from oneness is not a constant state of mystical bliss. It is a steady practice of remembering the truth whenever you become aware of forgetting it. It is returning again and again to the quiet assurance that the life you call yours is not yours at all. It is God's life expressing itself in individual form. And because it is God's life, it carries within it all that is necessary for harmony, for peace, for fulfillment. There may be moments when you forget this truth, when fear rises, when old habits of pleading or striving return. But even this is an opportunity. For each time you notice fear, that noticing becomes a doorway back to recognition. Each time you feel separation, that feeling becomes the invitation to realize oneness. In this way, even your weaknesses become instruments of awakening. As this awareness grows, something remarkable takes place. You find that you are no longer living for outcomes. You are no longer depending on circumstances for peace. You are no longer waiting for signs that God is with you. Instead, you begin to sense the presence in the midst of every appearance, pleasant or unpleasant. You begin to walk through the day with an inner stillness, a quiet confidence, a freedom from personal burden. This, my friends, is living from the awareness of oneness. It is not dramatic. It is not accompanied by fireworks or emotional highs. It is gentle, steady, transformative. It is the unfolding of a life no longer lived as a separate self, but as the transparency through which God expresses himself. And now, as we bring this hour of contemplation to its close, let us gather the thread that has moved quietly through each moment we have shared. The answer you have sought is already within you, not as something to be attained, not as a blessing to be granted, but as the eternal presence that has never departed from your own being. You began this journey perhaps feeling that God was distant, that your prayers were unheard, that your needs required divine intervention from above. But I hope you can now perceive, even faintly, that such beliefs belong only to the old sense of self, the self that imagines itself separate, alone, striving to reach God through pleading. That sense of self has never been your true identity. It is a shadow formed by centuries of misunderstanding. The truth is far simpler, far gentler, and infinitely more profound. God has never been absent from you. God has never withheld anything from you. God has never stood apart from your longing, waiting to be persuaded. The fullness of God has been the very substance of your being from the beginning, and it awaits only your recognition. You need not strive to achieve this truth. You need not force yourself into belief. You need only rest in the quiet awareness that oneness is the reality of your existence, whether you feel it or not. For spiritual truth is not dependent upon your emotions, it is dependent upon God alone. And God, being infinite, needs no assistance from human will in order to be what he is. As you go from this place, let your life become a gentle practice of remembrance, not a constant effort, but a simple returning again and again to the awareness of the presence within. When fear arises, remember, God is here. When confusion appears, remember, the wisdom of God is the very mind functioning as me. When lack seems near, remember, the substance of God is the only supply I have ever known. And when loneliness touches you, remember, I and the Father are one. These recognitions need not be dramatic. They need not produce sudden sensations. They simply open the inner door through which grace reveals what has always been true. Let us rest for a moment in silent acknowledgement. The presence that I seek is the presence that I am. The life that I call upon is the life that lives as me. The love that I long for is the love that is expressing through me. The answer is already given because God is already here. This is the end of our words, but it is not the end of the truth they point to. Carry this awareness with you gently. Let it unfold at its own pace. You need do nothing more than remain receptive, open, and willing to recognize what has always been so. May this recognition grow quietly within you until you know not through argument, not through emotion, but through direct inner realization that you live in God and God lives as you. And in that knowing, your search ends and your true life begins.